There is a quote, a single phrase that has outlasted empires and whispered courage into the hearts of millions. It was not born in a lecture hall or on the pages of a philosophical treatise, but in the most unimaginable crucible of human suffering. It is a quote that challenges everything we believe about power, control, and the very nature of existence. It comes from a man who lost everything, a man who stared into the abyss of his own humanity and returned with an insight so profound it would change the course of modern psychology. The words are simple, yet they carry the weight of a world on fire. Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. This is the story of that man, Viktor Frankl, and the extraordinary journey that led him to this singular, powerful conclusion. The year is 1930. The city is Vienna. This isn't just a place. It's a golden age of intellectual curiosity and artistic fervor. For a young, brilliant neurologist and psychiatrist like Viktor Frankl, it is a city of limitless potential. Sigmund Freud's psychoanalysis is the dominant force, a well-established map of the human psyche. Frankl, however, a young man with a spirit of both deep compassion and intellectual rebellion, saw a different path. He was a student of Freud and later Alfred Adler, but he felt their theories were missing a vital element. They spoke of pleasure and power as the primary drives of man. Frankl saw something else. He saw a deep, unyielding desire for purpose, for meaning. In this vibrant pre-war Vienna, Frankl began to develop his own school of thought. He called it logotherapy, from the Greek word logos, meaning meaning. He believed that our most fundamental drive was not for pleasure or power, but to find a reason to live, a purpose for our existence. He was already a trailblazer, making groundbreaking contributions to suicidology and pioneering new approaches to mental health. His work was gaining international recognition. Frankl was a man on a mission, building a life, a career, and a family. He was on the cusp of greatness, poised to take his place among the giants of psychology. But even as the intellectual lights of Vienna shone brightly, a shadow was beginning to stretch across Europe. A new, terrifying ideology was taking root. It was an ideology that sought to strip away the very things Frankl believed were essential for a meaningful life: dignity, purpose, and most terrifyingly, humanity itself. The year 1938 brought the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria by Nazi Germany. The intellectual vibrancy of Vienna was replaced by an atmosphere of fear and persecution. Jewish citizens like Frankl and his family found themselves living under a new and brutal reality. Frankl's life was turned upside down. He was dismissed from his hospital position and his work was banned. He found himself working as a neurologist in a Jewish hospital, a place where the sick and the marginalized sought refuge. He was in a constant state of turmoil, facing impossible choices every day. As the Nazis began their mass deportations, Frankl had a choice to make. He had a visa to the United States, an opportunity to escape and protect his groundbreaking manuscript, the very blueprint of logotherapy. But what about his parents, his wife? He was torn. In a moment of profound spiritual crisis, he turned to his father for guidance, a man whose wisdom had always guided him. His father simply pointed to a fragment of a stone tablet from a synagogue that had been destroyed by the Nazis. The fragment contained the broken Hebrew letters of one of the 10 Commandments: "Honor thy father and mother." This was the moment that sealed his fate. Frankl tore up the visa. He would not abandon his parents. He chose a path of suffering with his family over one of freedom without them. His decision was a profound act of loyalty, an affirmation of his own philosophy, but it was also a choice that would lead him directly into the darkest chapter of human history.
The choice to stay in Vienna was an act of profound love, but it came at a price Frankl could barely comprehend. In 1942, the nightmare became a brutal reality. He, his wife, his parents, and his brother were all deported to the Theresienstadt concentration camp. The journey itself was a harbinger of the horrors to come. Crammed into a cattle car with dozens of others, the air thick with fear and the stench of unwashed bodies, Frankl could only hold his wife's hand and witness the slow, agonizing erosion of hope. This was not a journey, it was a descent. Upon arrival, the first act was the most symbolic and devastating. They were stripped of everything, not just their possessions, but their names, their identities, their humanity. Frankl was no longer Viktor Frankl, the brilliant psychiatrist with a promising future. He was prisoner number 119104. His manuscript, the culmination of years of work and the very foundation of logotherapy, was confiscated and destroyed. The life he had built, the future he had imagined, vanished in an instant. He was reduced to a faceless, nameless cog in a vast, dehumanizing machine. This was the moment where he truly understood the meaning of having everything taken away. Life in the camp was a constant, grueling test of endurance. Frankl toiled for hours on end, building railway tunnels, digging trenches, and enduring the merciless beatings of the guards. Hunger was a perpetual gnawing presence. The daily ration was a small piece of bread and a watery soup, a meager offering that barely sustained life. Disease was rampant, and death was a constant, looming companion. For many, the will to live was the first thing to go. They would succumb to what Frankl later called existential frustration, a feeling of utter pointlessness. They would simply lie down in their bunks and refuse to get up, waiting for the end. Frankl watched his fellow prisoners lose all sense of self. They were no longer husbands, fathers, or doctors. They were just prisoners, living moment to moment, their minds fixated on the next bowl of watery soup or the next piece of bread. The human psyche, he observed, began to wither under these conditions. They regressed to a primitive state where survival was the only goal. All previous morals, all aspirations seemed to disappear. But Frankl, a doctor to his core, continued to observe. He was a scientist in hell, turning his suffering into a laboratory for understanding the deepest reaches of the human soul. The final blow came in the winter of 1944. Frankl was separated from his wife, his parents, and his brother. He was transferred to Auschwitz, and then later to Kaufering and Turkheim, subcamps of Dachau. He never saw his wife again, or his parents, or his brother. He would later learn that his wife had perished in Bergen-Belsen, and his parents had been sent to the gas chambers. In the darkness of his barrack, shivering from the cold, his body emaciated and his spirit crushed, he was confronted with the ultimate form of loss. He had lost his freedom, his career, his identity, and now his family. There was nothing left. It was here, at the lowest point of his existence, that Frankl was forced to confront the question: if everything is taken, what remains? What is left of a man when he has nothing? In the face of such absolute loss, one might expect a man to crumble, to surrender to the void. But it was in this very darkness that Viktor Frankl made his most profound and lasting discovery. He had been stripped of his home, his family, his profession, and his very name. But he began to notice something. He still had control over his inner world. The guards could break his body, but they could not touch his mind. They could not dictate his thoughts, his memories, or the images he conjured in his head. Frankl started to practice a form of mental escape. He would intentionally step outside the brutal reality of the camp and into a world of his own making. In the bitter cold, while a guard's whip cracked in the distance, he would close his eyes and imagine himself standing in a warm, brightly lit lecture hall. He would see his students' faces, feel the passion of teaching, and mentally reconstruct the manuscript he had lost, piece by agonizing piece. This was not a mere daydream. It was an act of profound defiance. It was the moment he realized that his mind was a sanctuary, a last bastion of freedom no one could penetrate. He also found solace in the simple, overlooked beauties of the world that still existed, even here. One evening, after a grueling day of labor, he and a fellow prisoner watched a sunset. The sky exploded in a riot of color, painting the clouds in shades of crimson and gold. For a brief, fleeting moment, the horror of their surroundings melted away. He saw the beauty not as a cruel joke, but as a reminder that the world was still capable of wonder, that even in this cesspool of human misery, life itself held a meaning that transcended their suffering. But his most powerful and enduring escape was through love. Even after he was separated from his wife, even after he had lost all hope of ever seeing her again, he would speak to her. He would imagine her face, her voice, her smile, and in those moments he realized something astonishing. He no longer needed to know if she was alive. He no longer needed to see her physical presence to feel the power of their connection. His love for her was an internal, unassailable fact. It was a purpose, a reason to endure. He found that a man can be taken from his wife, but no one can take his love for her. This was the birth of his central philosophy, the idea that would become the foundation of his life's work, logotherapy. Frankl observed that the prisoners who survived were not necessarily the strongest, the healthiest, or the youngest. The ones who survived were the ones who still had a reason to live. They had a purpose, a meaning. It might have been a child they wanted to see again, an unfinished work, or a belief they were determined to hold on to. Frankl's insight was that even in a situation where the future seemed completely hopeless, a man could find a reason to carry on. He could find meaning not just despite his suffering, but even because of it. The very act of choosing one's attitude in the face of despair gave life a purpose.
With his discovery of inner freedom, Viktor Frankl was no longer just a victim of circumstance. He became a man with a purpose. He had to live to tell the world what he had learned, to rebuild the lost manuscript that held the key to his philosophy. This was his why. It was this newfound purpose that allowed him to choose his response to the immense suffering around him. He began to observe his fellow prisoners not just as a doctor, but as a man searching for a living, breathing testament to his own theories. He saw that those who survived with their humanity intact were not simply physically strong, they were the ones who found a reason to carry on. For some, it was the memory of a loved one. For others, it was the thought of an unfinished project or a future they still believed in. Frankl himself became a quiet source of this purpose. He would hold clandestine therapy sessions in the barracks, listening to the despair of others, helping them find their own tiny sliver of meaning in the overwhelming darkness. He would tell them of the importance of dignity, of holding on to their past identities, of refusing to be reduced to mere animals. He was a beacon of hope in a place designed to extinguish it. Frankl came to understand that suffering in itself is not what breaks a person. It is suffering without meaning. And so he developed the idea of the tragic optimism. It's the ability to find meaning and hope in the face of what he called the tragic triad: pain, guilt, and death. Pain, he argued, can be transformed into a heroic accomplishment through the courage to endure it. Guilt can be a catalyst for change and self-improvement. And death can give our lives meaning by making every moment, every choice, and every act precious and finite. This was not a passive philosophy. It was a call to action. In the camps, this meant small but profound acts of resistance. It was giving a fellow prisoner your last morsel of bread, even when you were starving. It was standing with dignity during the daily inspections, refusing to let the dehumanizing process break you. It was finding a reason to smile at a bird on a wire or a single star in the night sky. These were not grand gestures, but they were powerful affirmations of a life that was still, in some way, being chosen. Frankl himself found strength in his memories, in the love he felt for his wife. He would imagine her, talk to her in his mind, and see her face in the faces of others. The lesson was clear. You cannot control what happens to you, but you can control your response. You can choose to be a victim, or you can choose to be the person who finds meaning even when there is none to be found. This choice was the last bastion of human dignity, a fortress of the soul that no amount of suffering could tear down. It was the ultimate proof of his theory, and it was a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his life.
In 1945, the war ended. The camps were liberated. For Viktor Frankl, the experience was a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. There was the sheer, overwhelming joy of survival, the intoxicating taste of freedom. But there was also a crushing, silent dread. He had endured for years on the hope of reuniting with his family, of finding his wife. He returned to Vienna, a city he no longer recognized, haunted by the specters of the past. The truth he so desperately feared was confirmed. His wife, his parents, and his brother were all dead. He was alone. But in the face of this final, devastating loss, the lessons he had learned in the camps became his only guide. He had lost everything, but he had not lost his purpose. His purpose was to live to tell the story, to share the philosophy that had saved his own soul. He found a new sense of meaning, not in the past, but in the future. He believed that his suffering was not in vain. It was a testament, a powerful living laboratory that had proven his theories to be true. He saw his responsibility not just as a survivor, but as a messenger. Frankl went on to rebuild his life and his career. He became a professor, a public figure, and a world-renowned speaker. In just 9 days, he dictated the manuscript that would become one of the most influential books of the 20th century, Man's Search for Meaning. The book was not an academic treatise, but a raw, honest account of his experiences. It was a story that showed in the most powerful way imaginable that even in a world without hope, a person could find a reason to live. It became a global bestseller, translated into dozens of languages, and has sold millions of copies. Viktor Frankl's story is a timeless lesson. It reminds us that while we cannot always control what happens to us, we can always control our response. We are not prisoners of our circumstances, but masters of our own attitudes. Frankl taught us that a life without meaning is a life in a vacuum, a life without purpose. But he also taught us that meaning is not something you are given, it is something you find. It is a choice you make, an act of courage and defiance that can transform a life of suffering into a life of purpose. It is the greatest lesson of all. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredible journey. If you found meaning in Viktor Frankl's story, we encourage you to share it with others. If this story resonated with you, please leave a comment below to share your thoughts. We love hearing from you and engaging in these important conversations. Don't forget to like this video, share it with a friend, and subscribe to our channel to join us on our next journey into the depths of human insight. Be sure to hit that notification bell so you never miss a new video. Until next time.